Oh.
Okay. You're muted, huh? Okay. You're now. Okay.
Was apping you. Good.
Okay.
So we are all ready. 2 more
Now we are
minutes.
all ready. Yeah.
No, 4 minutes.
One thing, I first thought that I had 5 minutes and I prepared for 5 minutes, but now I saw that it was 4. So I tried to squeeze, but it's around those times. Don't worry.
Yeah.
I have 3 minutes, isn't it? 3.
Yes, you have 3.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
I will also need 3. So
that's good. Okay.
So definitely, I would assume it's not more than 4.5 at least. That's
it's okay. Yeah, no, it's okay.
You know, this is Scandinavian punctuality.
Yes, yes.
You should know. You should know living in Sweden.
I know. I love it. I like it.
I'm not that worried about where the light comes and how do I look like, but it's more about timing.
This is very good.
Sorry, guys. This is.
I relate. I relate to
very
that.
Good. Okay.
Two more minutes.
Okay.
It's a bit exciting.
Do we have any idea how many we have online?
Yes, you can see it in the on the right.
I don't dare to go anywhere so that I don't have the wrong button. I don't dare to push wrong buttons.
But it's 39 people now.
Okay.
That's good.
Opening the room in 1 minute, says Burak. Okay.
Okay, so. Good.
Seconds. My text changed a bit from yesterday. I put a technical thing in also.
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the first out of 2 webinars on creative economies organized by TransEurope Halls and QMedia. In today's webinar, we will explore more about mapping CCIs and working conditions of creative and cultural workforce in the EU before, during, and after the COVID-19. Next week, Thursday, the 4th of June, we will talk about new business and revenue models in the creative economies and policies for managing cultural ecology. But first of all, some technicalities. If you have problems hearing us, please refresh your browser, and if this does not work, go to a different browser. We would like to make this session interactive, and you will see a chat box in which you can write whenever you want. In 5 minutes, we will activate the question mode, and you can send your questions. After each presentation is done, we will share the presentations with you already during this webinar. The session is being recorded. The webinar today is divided into 3 blocks. First, after me, Tere Badia will give you more news on economic issues related to our sector. Then Jarna Heinonen will introduce DISCE project. We will have a small survey for you and to hear more about our audience today. This will be followed by a second block with a presentation and discussion by Valeria Pica from Gran Sasso Science Institute. She will talk about mapping CCIs in the EU. This is followed by a Q&A led by Ignacy Guardans. Then we will move to a second presentation by Temshin Dent and Roberta Comunian, both working at King's College London, on the working conditions of the creative and cultural workforce. The Q&A will be led by Elena Politseva from IETM. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Tere Badia, Secretary General of Culture Action Europe.
So thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be in this first DISCE webinar. During the last couple of years, I'm going to bring you a bit of background. So during the last couple of weeks, we have been interviewing all our members, Culture Action Europe members, and just to see how they cope with the situation. And of course, you know, most probably that that's a coincidence that the main issues right now for the cultural sector, I'm going to just list them just. And so on one side, there's a huge loss of jobs and income all around our sector. The second one, it's issues related to mobility, of course, the restrictions to mobility. The third one is the digital dimension that has become more vital than ever to maintain this personal and professional relations. And the fourth is the internationalization, international cultural collaboration and creation that is also under threat as all the emergency measures proposed by the countries are designed to safeguard national cultural production. And how is the Commission reacting to this? So I'm the one who's going to bring you the bad news. So the last news are very bad. The proposal for the budget for the next 7 years, 21-28, is true, it's an unprecedented financial envelope. It's the biggest ever proposed, but the situation of the cultural sector in this MFF, in this multi-annual financial framework, represents a significant cut of the two programs dedicated to culture and education, Erasmus Plus and Creative Europe. The new figures related to these programs are below the Commission's original proposal presented in 2018. And the decrease of this original budget is a very bad message for the sector. It ignores completely the contribution of the cultural sector in the European economy, in the European cohesion, and in the European project itself, and will not support the recovery of the cultural workers and organizations in this COVID paradigm. This will rather consolidate the precariousness of the cultural sector and its workers and weaken the cooperation project among Europe and the educational skills of future generations. And on the other side, whereas it is true that culture and tourism are mentioned in the REACT European Union funds belonging to the structural and cohesion funds, the specific investments will be decided by the member state. That's why we are calling the European Commission to ensure transparency of regular information on the way these specific measures contribute to the cultural and creative sectors and cultural and creative workers across Europe. Moreover, the inclusion of culture in this recovery plan funds will not be effective if we don't have a statute of the artist for all Europe. And so education and culture are not, it's clear that education and culture are not at the center of this new European future. So I leave it here. I give the floor back to Mike. And Mike, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Tere, and it's very sad to hear the news, and let's all join together to work on it. Now I would like to introduce to you all Jarna Heinonen. She is the principal investigator of the DISCE Consortium, and Jarna is connected to the University of Turku in Finland.
Thank you, Mika and Tere, for your introductions to this webinar. Yeah, it's really great to be here discussing about our research project, DISCE. DISCE stands for Developing Inclusive and Sustainable Creative Economies. DISCE raises up a question: what are inclusive and sustainable creative economies? And more importantly, how can they be developed? Sounds so simple, but in order to tackle the questions, we have joined our forces. DISCE is a partnership of 4 European research institutes. In addition to the University of Turku, Finland, we have researchers from the Gran Sasso Science Institute from Italy, King's College London from the UK, and Stockholm School of Economics Riga from Latvia. DISCE has also 2 experienced stakeholder partners, namely Comedie from Brussels and European Network Trans-Europe House from Lund. We are most grateful for them for organizing this webinar series, which actually demonstrates our DISCE approach. To find out what are inclusive and sustainable economies, we actively co-create and interact with stakeholders to validate the relevance of our findings. This webinar is one way to communicate with our stakeholders, and we hope that there will be more and different types of events for us to continue two-way conversations with you. DISCE approach is not only about co-creation, but it's also about conducting research with multiple methods. Through robust statistical analysis, we create new and better indicators to portray creative economies in Europe. We also wish to develop rich understanding of the creative economies through regional case studies, which focus on different types of creative ecologies found around 10 middle-sized European towns. Last fall, we started our regional case studies with a pilot in Enschede, the Netherlands. We are currently starting other regional case studies in Pori, Finland, in Liepāja, Latvia, in L'Aquila, Italy, and in Dundee, the UK. We will continue with other 5 case studies after the summer. Given the restrictions related to the COVID-19, you may imagine that we needed to change our plans with the empirical fieldwork. We have quickly turned to online mode with our interviews, consultations, and surveys. Nevertheless, we expect our fieldwork to be finalized by the end of this year. DISCE approaches the inclusive and sustainable creative economies from different angles. Soon, the researchers from the TSSI will tell you how we plan to develop better statistics and indicators for creative economies. We also explore creative and cultural workforce, skills development, and the creative higher education provision across Europe. You will also hear more about this today. Furthermore, DISCE investigates new forms of activity and related value creation models, be it in work, unpaid work, self-employment, or in companies. This is done to identify innovative ways for inclusive and sustainable value creation. Finally, DISCE rethinks inclusive and sustainable growth by considering growth not only as GDP, but also as cultural development. By producing a cultural development index, DISCE will inform policymakers to promote creative economies to contribute to cultural development in Europe. To summarize, DISCE will indeed challenge the existing understanding of the nature and role of creative economies in the society. This will be done by answering the DISCE research questions. What are inclusive and sustainable creative economies, and how they can be supported? So please stay tuned and follow our research. While I turn this back to Mike, I encourage you all to engage with DISCE today and also in the future.
Thank you very much, Jarna. Before I introduce the next speaker, we would really like to know who you are, and therefore we are sending a small survey in the webinar window. It would be great if you can click your profession so we know our audience of today. And while you are doing this, I would like to use this time to introduce the second block this afternoon with Valeria Pica, postdoctoral research fellow from Gran Sasso Science Institute. She will be talking on mapping CCIs in the EU. Within the context of DISCE project, they are looking into both nationwide and EU-wide definitions and categorizations used in the sector. Ignacy Guardans, CEO of Clumedia in Brussels, will lead you through the Q&A together with Chiara Borlina and Alessandro Crociato from Gran Sasso Institute. Valeria, The floor is yours.
So thanks, Mika. Thanks, everybody, also for organizing the DISCE webinar series and for inviting us to share our work with such a broad audience. GSSI is in charge of WUPI2, aiming at the identification, mapping, and statistics of cultural and creative industries. Our team is composed of both quantitative and qualitative researchers. And besides me, today you will meet also Chiara Burlina and Alessandro Crociata during the question time, and then Alessandra Faggian. Next, please. So the rationale for WUPI2 is the need to combine together in a solid statistical description the size, the economic value, but also the social value CCIs have for contemporary society. Next, please. In these terms, our main objective is developing a comprehensive understanding of CCIs through improved indicators at national and EU level, their performance and contribution to society and economy. Next, please. The first challenge we met was about the definition of CCIs and creative economy in general. We needed a classification enabling us to harmonize data that could be relevant and usable to the overall DISCE research question. Next, please. The classification that better fitted our methodology is the one published in 2008 by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. There are more recent classifications, but this one was and is actually more consistent to our purpose. The classification, as you may see, groups CCIs in 4 main sets of categories: heritage, arts, media, and functional creations, subsequently corresponding to a list of cultural and creative activities, all connected together and all responding to creative industries. Next, please. So, given our task to measure CCI's performances, what indicators can be more feasible to us? Next, please. When talking about the social value of CCIs, we decided to take into account 2 main characteristics that can tell a lot on the impact CCIs have on society, namely inclusivity and sustainability. 2 characteristics that also in the times of pandemic have a great importance, as we will see in a short while. Next, please. Inclusivity and sustainability concern the access to cultural opportunities, the role of social minorities, both meant as audience and creative workforce, the innovativeness and the use of new technologies, as well as professional skills in relation to newly created enterprises. Not to mention one of the most relevant topics, namely the correlation between health and well-being, matching social and cultural program. Next, please. So, to go back to the taxonomy, to the classification we just mentioned, here I tried to synthesize the 4 groups to see what at the moment has been the effect of COVID-19 on CCIs. I selected just a few examples that are meaningful to observe how the sector is responding to the lockdown. We do not have yet data, as Jarna actually mentioned before. We had to reformulate and remodulate surveys and interviews, and data will be available by the end of the year. But in this way, actually, we can just make some observation. Next, please. So, concerning the heritage sector, the green one, here you see a few data about museums all around the globe. These percentages and data are taken from the NEMO survey, that was actually launched in the month of March. At that moment, they estimated the 80% loss of incomes. At the moment, we considered 90% of loss. That it's also affecting museum professionals, and especially freelancers and educators in the museum sector. In the arts, the red one, here we have some data related to the theater sector that open a window on two main elements: the production phase and the job inequality of the system. Because, as you know, the majority of musicians or actors are remunerated on show days and not for rehearsals. The media sector, the yellow one, is just in this sector. Actually, I was just focusing on book and film festivals that have been almost everywhere cancelled or postponed sine die. If you consider, for instance, that just a few exceptions, for instance, the book festival in Turin that has been held in a digital form, it's difficult then to measure the total loss of the sector, because we don't know how much the lockdown will last and what will be the effect on a medium and long term. What we can see is that the core of the arts had to close, with dramatic consequences for the workforce. But the functional creations sector instead is then reacting a little bit better, especially for the digital sector, demonstrating actually a higher degree of resilience. And resilience in this term can become a measure for sustainability. Next, please. Talking about digital services and the digital transformation, here just an example among others, the setting up of the social distancing festival that Nick Green, a playwright in Toronto, launched to offer artists a platform where they can upload rehearsals or spectacles or anyway, all their production that have been cancelled or delayed during this time. But these points make a question arise. How sustainable is the digital offer as the only one available at the moment? Next, please. In times of crisis, we see how, on the one side, inclusivity is taken advantage of digital services. We have had really a huge amount of data and activities that has been uploaded actually on the internet. But on the other side, the digitalization made actually marked a social cultural gap, because some areas and social groups are not provided with the good connectivity, and this element is actually deepening the digital divide that is becoming a social priority. About sustainability, we have seen how in times of crisis, CCIs are depending on protective measures that local government are making available to let them survive. If you think, for instance, at Germany, that already in the month of March launched a grant program of about 500 million euros to support artists and freelancers, as well as Spain for artists and galleries. And just yesterday, actually, the publication of the Recovery Fund, that the EU grant program for the cultural and creative sector. Next, please. So to conclude the previous... this one. Thank you. To conclude, future activities for a comprehensive understanding of CCIs are the production of an atlas of culture, so a mapping, actually a kind of database to map European CCIs, the identification of relevant variables to better define the sector. Among them, we can consider actually the employment growth rate or the value added that matching together actually show the very positive relation between growth and presence of CCIs in a region, and the creation of a composite index of creative and cultural, sustainable and inclusive industries that will be helpful for further researchers in the field. Some of the indicators that are specifically connected and related to sustainability and inclusivity, such as multilingual education and culture for social cohesion, will help us to better measure social value for CCIs. Next, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Valeria. I'd like to step in now with a few comments there. Excellent presentation. And the first conclusion is, of course, that the creative and cultural industries are different and they are composed by very different sectors. And that is one of the issues that is very relevant now, because we all know how difficult these times are for the CCIs and what the very, very difficulties that are being posed and the challenges that are being posed by the COVID-19 into the different industries. And of course, that is affecting differently depending on the sector. Now, I believe that even those who are apparently less affected, such as everything that could be included under the denomination of media, for example, apparently it will come out better, but that is not exactly so. That might also be apparent. Just to put you a very simple example, of course, everybody's watching things on screen, but those things that people are watching on screen at home need to be shot, you know, and shootings require, you know, social distance, and how the hell do you do that, you know, and then they're going to become much more expensive, to be more serious here. So even in something that is so obvious that everybody believes okay in cinema, but of course the same applies to music. I mean, without festivals, what can you do? You know, you cannot showcase. So the situation is complicated, and this is one of the issues where this exercise that the DISCE is doing is important, because we are seeing, you know, different measures in different countries. But one of the problems is precisely the visibility of the cultural and creative industries, of their contribution, the economic contribution, the social contribution, and that visibility is obviously not obvious and cannot be taken for granted. And we are at a very difficult moment in which the cultural and creative sector will be in direct competition with many other sectors. Today, this morning, Nissan told that they are closing down, you know, almost all its activity across Europe. That's just an example. We could mention many others. You know, Lufthansa has been purchased by the German state, in fact. You know, so this is the context where the cultural and creative industries need to make themselves visible, and they need to make themselves understood. What is it that they bring? What is it that they can provide? And that what is why, of course, they deserve a very special role in this whole effort, which is irregular. So that's what I would like to focus. The effort is irregular across Europe. You mentioned Germany, you mentioned Spain. Not everybody in Spain would be happy with what is going on. So it is being very different. So that would be my question for you. One of the obvious differences is the amount of money that is being put in the different countries and different regions. But perhaps money is not everything, especially for the recovery point. So how do you see the other components that need to be looked at in this new post-COVID situation from a policy perspective, but also from the cultural and creative industries themselves in their own effort to recover? You know, will the difference be only about those who receive more money will be better and those who don't will not? Or what other components in this ecosystem do you think will count to really start looking forward and try to move ahead?
Well, probably we will need another webinar to respond actually to this question. But basically, the first thing that I should say that is actually funds are needed in the short term. But then if we think at the medium and long term perspective, we have to change our point of view. Probably in the cultural and creative sector, we are experiencing a unique opportunity to redesign and restructure the cultural ecosystem. But we need actually to make a change of perspective. Probably what could be also important in these terms is then to use and then to apply the concept of commons to CCIs. If we start thinking at CCIs as a part of a common heritage, then we will see also how some aspects that are typical of CCIs can improve and can actually make the difference on the long term. If you just consider that CCIs, for instance, attract a skilled workforce and qualified human capital that positively affect the economic growth. So what does it mean? That in the next future, and I guess that probably we will see the impact of the lockdown, we will be really perceivable in the next month or in a year time at least. So it's not nothing that we can really define in this very moment. But what probably we'll need is a new professional skills. It's a change of attitude in terms of engagement, and also a capability in building adaptation. So basically the aim to integrate culture in the social policies.
So thanks. Alessandro and Chiara, you've been part of this research team as well. There's some questions about the concept of inclusivity here. How do you define inclusivity? How do you look into inclusivity in this context?
Okay. Yes, of course, inclusivity has a broad meanings. We can reduce these category meanings. For us, inclusivity, the means of inclusivity is to consider to improve the access to cultural opportunities, as Valeria said during her presentation. And of course, in terms of access, to consider the role of social minorities, to try to solve the gender gap, the migrants gap, or to taking seriously in consideration ethnic minorities, not only in cultural consumptions, but also in cultural production, cultural creative production. Another way to see the terms inclusivity is to paving the way to allow new business model and new in order to create new enterprise or entrepreneurships. And finally, from our point of view, there's a sort of cross boundaries between inclusivity and sustainability terms. And what I would say is that to be inclusive means to consider culture and creativity as a source of health and well-being improving.
Now, Chiara, the concept of functional creation, it's supposed to include several parts of your research. Could you define that a little bit better? The area covered by this concept of functional creation?
Valeria, would you answer for Chiara?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Valeria.
Yeah, I can. Yeah,
I would like just.
Yeah, so Chiara,
I would like just to add something about the loss, because I have seen a lot of messages talking about losses, both economically and for what concerns the workforce. So one report from UNESCO that came out in April, 1 month ago, was talking about losses that in general creative and cultural industries are going to face due to the COVID-19. And they are talking about more than $2020 billion for the overall industry in general, and about 30% of the royalties for the rapporteurs in general. So to answer about the question of Ivo, so loss of 80% of income. So they are going to face a lot of losses in terms of royalties, in terms of workforce, in terms of earning. For example, UK musicians are going to lose almost $40 million in earnings. So, I mean, this economic crisis is going to affect a lot the creative and cultural sector.
I don't know if we have a lot of time, so just if you can, in a flash, reply to this, otherwise it will be in the
very, very quickly. According to the UNCTAD classification for functional creation, so we consider all the digital sector, also the digital design or the digital work.
Thank you. We could have more, we could be discussing for hours, but we need to move forward. So the next presentation is in charge of the research team of the King's College London. It's going to be, the presentation will be in charge by Tamsin Dent, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the KCL. Roberta Communion, who's a reader and in creative economy at the KCL. And they will be joined by Elena Politseva, who is the head of policy and research at the IETM, which, as you know, is the International Network for Contemporary Performing Arts. The floor is yours, Tamsin. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacy. Can everyone hear me? Good, excellent. Thank you to everyone for all your comments thus far. Please do state if I'm talking too fast or if there's anything you don't understand. I'm just going to briefly go through a document that myself and colleagues on the DISCE project published just in April. So it's, if we go to the next slide. So this report is available on our website, along with another report which is looking at specifically at higher education and creative and cultural work. But today I'm just going to talk about the report which is looking on how cultural and creative work is defined at a European and national level within Europe. So our report uncovered tensions at the macro, the meso and the micro level across both the European Union framework of how to define creative and cultural workers and then at the national level. And I saw that there was some questions already about different types of definitions of what they mean, which are, I think, perfectly valid. So starting at the macro level, the European Union's classification, which was developed following a task force from 2009 to 2011, so just after the economic crash of 2008, applies a distinct label of cultural labour as opposed to a creative label, includes individuals working in a cultural-related economic activity and those working in cultural economic activities outside of the workforce. And then what we found in our report is that this application varies. Could you, Katerina, do you mind just going to the next slide? Actually go back one, thank you. So this is the European report which defines cultural monitoring at the European level. But what we found that this application of defining cultural and creative workers varies at the national level. So on our website, if you go to the publications section, you'll see links to profiles of every single EU national country in how they classify cultural and creative workers. And you'll see that there's a variety across them. Next slide, please. In our report, we discuss in detail 3 national frameworks just to give you a sense of how they differ from each other. So we look at the United Kingdom, the Netherlands and Italy to give a variance of the classification between the European and the national level. Now, what this creates is significant differences in terms of the number of cultural and creative workers. For example, in the UK, the European Union classifies 1.5 million cultural workers, whereas in the national framework, it's 5.3 million. So it's quite a big jump. And that is repeated throughout the kind of methodology. Within our report, we also discuss implications of the absence of a clear overarching definition of the creative economy and how this allows a multitude of constructions or applications at the national level. There's also a critical lack of socioeconomic characteristics within the European framework and, again, variance across the national level. And that relates to questions such as race, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status and mobility, which, given fluidity of the creative and cultural workforce across boundaries, and potential barriers to that emerging from the UK's exit from the European Union is problematic. Can you go to the next slide, please, Katerina? Actually, jump ahead one. Thank you. So then in the report, we also look at alternative sources of occupational data that have emerged on the cultural and creative workforce, sometimes at the European level and sometimes at the national framework, which gives varying ideas of creative occupations, and some of which has responded to the precarious labour conditions, which my colleague Roberta is going to draw in more detail after myself. So sources of this data are varied. They come from non-governmental bodies, guilds, trade unions, large cultural institutions, local municipalities, and they can be in relation to either a specific sector or a specific issue, for example, gendered employment in screen work, or museum curators and socioeconomic status. Then we also see at the micro level an emergence of smaller scale studies. So this is studies that could be done by activist groups, campaigning groups, singular organisations doing a kind of workforce survey. A lot of these studies are done in partnership with higher education or with academics or researchers, looking at, again, at a specific impact of precarious labour or of cultural and creative work. And what we found is that this is a growing body of research. People have access to online technology and the capabilities to produce and present their own research, which is producing a kind of alternative narrative to the reality of creative and cultural workers that isn't being captured at a macro level. So in order to develop our understanding on this level of research, we have just launched a survey. Katerina, thank you. So this survey is available on our website next to the report. Thank you, somebody's just put it in the comments. It's available in English, French, German and Italian. It's designed to reach to organisations who are gathering their own data, be it a survey, be it a qualitative interview report on the creative and cultural workforce, or on creative and cultural occupations. So if this is something that's relevant to you or your organisation, or you know of another organisation that is doing this sort of work, we'd be really grateful if you could fill in the survey so we can gather your information and we can make it more visible through the platform of the DISCE project. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Roberta, who's going to talk in more detail about the sort of relationship between precarious labour in the cultural and creative workforce and the impact of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, so this is a little bit of going deeper into what Tom has just described. So when we finished our report, COVID was just sort of starting, or the impact of it was just emerging. And some other colleagues at King's, we started really looking at what was being captured by an extensive range of surveys that was being launched in response to COVID-19. So this is going to be published as a journal article probably next week or the week after, and we will be able to share it obviously through the DISCE website at that point. But here I'm just summarizing the headlines of that article. So the main thing is we use the UK as a case study. Potentially this research could be replicated in any other European country or beyond. And what we did is we looked at all the surveys that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the creative economies, broadly defined. So whether they were surveys on specific sectors like film sector, or whether they were surveys more related to freelance workers in media sector. So we just wanted to capture what was being asked, and specifically also what was not being asked. So why are we doing these surveys, and how do the knowledge that they generate connects with the knowledge we already have of the sector? So looking at that, we obviously wanted to build on some long-term issues and knowledge that we have already of the sector. So it's not new that work is precarious in this sector. It's not new that this sector has very unstable working conditions. Therefore, asking those questions seem quite interesting because we know the situation even without asking those questions. And this specifically was building up on two issues. One of precarity, because in 2008 we had already a big financial crisis, and at that point in time the solution that seemed to have been found by the creative industry is to precarize work even more than it was before. So instead of people being employed in the sector, they were freelancing for the same companies that they would have been employed to by others. The other sector, the other issue on top of precarity at that point was the emergence discourse on resilience. So rather than actually acknowledging that those precarious working conditions, those have been framed as being a resilience response. So while the sector could not find other solution, decided that the workers should take on themselves to protect their own social securities and issues. So what we've seen at that moment in time is that resilience, as it says here, is really played by policy, by neoliberal policies, as a way to respond to crises. And what is interesting is thinking about how that might apply to the current crisis. So the critical findings, very quickly. One thing that we noticed on all this survey is the thing that were asked were very visible. On one side is the immediate revenue changes. Of course, these people are not working, they can't put up their shows, so they're not going to have any income out of that. And obviously the way the state or the government or the local authority could support that. So what kind of intervention could be put in place to support the sector? And that's things that we think are very visible. Of course, we have a lot of knowledge about all of these issues. But there are some other issues within the survey which we think are much more less visible and actually more unclear. So one thing that was quite disappointing is in all of those surveys, there was no attention whatsoever to demographic information. So while we asked how much income have you lost, we didn't ask whether the person losing the income was female or male, whether they had any disability, whether they belong to an ethnic minority. So in a sort of way, we're assuming the impact is bad for everyone in the sector. We're not actually understanding that it could be bad for some, but it could be terrible for others. So there is going to be a very different outcome to COVID-19 across the sector, and likely the minorities or the groups that were already disadvantaged before might feel the impact of the crisis even more. And we did that. We also found that obviously all that was asked and reflected on was the short-term implication of COVID. So not the relation that might have with the overall ecosystem, with people maybe not entering the sector, not starting up a business, not thinking about the creative economy as a sustainable career for their future. And in this respect, the very three brief conclusions that we draw from this analysis are that, and this is almost linked to policy recommendation on how we need to look at COVID-19, is that we need to position those creative and cultural work concerns not just as the impact of COVID-19. Those are structural issues that were there before, and unless we point out that they were there before and we should address them as such, we are going to get some very short-term solution and input from policy, but nothing that address the bigger questions. We need to make those demographic visible, really make an effort to actually argue that COVID-19 might have a negative impact overall, but it's going to be very negative for some and not so negative for others. So we need to highlight those differences within the sector. And the resilience discourse is quite interesting because it's coming back, as it did in the economic crisis previously, but it's coming back and needs to be linked to the fact that resilience is a response which should be expected from a sustainable system. If we are putting effort on sustainability, then we can expect resilience from the system. We can't expect a system that wasn't sustainable before to have resilience. So this is the conclusion. I'm happy to share the paper afterwards, of course. And I'll just pass now the floor to Elena Soliseva from IENT.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you just nod, Roberta?
Yeah.
Thank you. Tamsin and Roberta, thank you very much for your very interesting and important findings that you have just shared. I would like to remind our participants to post their questions, as some of them are already doing here in the chat box, or maybe some reactions to the presentation that we have just seen and heard. Well, myself, I really especially appreciate your focus on the critical focus on the resilience discourse, which has very deep consequences, economic and social consequences for the creative workforce. And I think that we should also think maybe deeper about how this resilience pressure has also impact on the creative work itself. So basically how this constant pressure to adapt, to survive, to juggle between different jobs, to go for hectic mobility and to change from project to project, how all that impacts ability of artists and creative workers actually to work, to create, and to express themselves. Because as it seems to me, sometimes this resilience also hinders the possibility to pursue kind of a deep and strong parcours based on political, artistic, and social values of an artist. And then another aspect is that it's not a surprise for anyone that innovation and experimentation for the creative workforce is not being largely supported publicly. That in many situations, artists don't have the resources to experiment and to transform their mission to innovate and to research. And then this is especially revealed today amid this pandemic, that public authorities are very often not able, not ready, and not willing to support cultural sector in the situation when it cannot produce any concrete outputs and count audiences, for example. At the same time, many sectors today, as we can see in many countries, many other sectors of economy, are being supported unconditionally, even if they also cannot work, while creative workers are pushed, for example, to produce things digitally, no matter whether it makes sense to audiences or not, no matter if it's comfortable for the artists to do it in terms of privacy, because not everyone is comfortable to perform from home, or in terms of safety. Not everyone is feeling comfortable to interact with audiences via digital platforms, let alone remuneration and competition with other sectors, which are more used to internet, let alone that. So my two questions actually would be, do you think if there would be some recognition of the atypical nature of the creative work, and therefore there would be some normal and structured support to the innovation and research and experimentation in the cultural creative sectors? If that would be in place, would that change the situation with precarity and the resilience discourse? And my second question is about the status, the social and legal status of creative worker. Do you think that it would make sense to look to map all interesting examples of that across, for example, EU member states or some other countries around Europe, and to imagine having such a framework at an international level, which definitely won't be legally binding, but at least it would stimulate member states to improve the social status of artists and on a national level. Thank you.
Dan, do you want to take the second question? I'll take the first.
Exactly what I was going to say.
Do you want to start with that, or I don't mind?
I don't mind starting with that. I'll be as brief as possible, because I think that raising the status of social legal status of creative workers is really important. It's incredibly tricky because I don't know about international legal frameworks of employment law, but I do know about the UK, and I know that the UK's framework for civil framework for supporting the workforce in general is very outdated. It speaks to an almost Fordist structure, which assumes that people are an employee, and the terminology associated with creative workers, which is variable. So we use terms like freelancer, we use terms like contractor, we use terms like project-based labour. A Canadian scholar called Greg Deputer will use the term flex worker to define a multitude of different types of working contracts, many of which aren't covered under the civil employment legislative framework, so are operating in this very grey area of not having an accountability system that recognises or values or protects them. It's very interesting to see that suddenly we're seeing union memberships go up, which has been particularly during the kind of neoliberal individualised drive of creative work in the UK. It's been going down, but suddenly it's starting to rise up. Changing policy around employment legislation is a very lengthy process, which normally requires quite a lot of individual sacrifice from people going through the employment tribunal system, which for many people in the creative and cultural work industry, just because of their social value and because of the reputation and resilience discourse, just aren't really willing to do. But I think it's a very important question, and it would be fascinating to look at this at a kind of international or even European level. So that,
yes.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
If I can answer briefly the first question, although it's big and it could really be an half an hour discussion. I recently read a paper which I'm going to share because somebody asked about references on resilience, which actually discussed about the different perspective between resilience and sustainable development. It wasn't a paper to do with culture. It was to do, for instance, with communities be affected by an earthquake or crisis, and it really sort of explain the literature between resilience is just assuming that somebody can respond to something bad that is happening and needs to be responded. And it's okay that you can say that that community was resilient or not. However, what if we were to link it with sustainability literature, which actually said it doesn't matter whether something bad or good happens to you, but you got a sustainable plan. You got a plan of action that basically allows you to then be sustainable and resilient when it's needed. So it's this kind of thing for me that is really important, moving that resilience discourse, which is also putting an emphasis to responding to something bad that it might happen to the sector, and obviously who's going to respond, who's going to pay those costs, to actually think about what if we made culture sustainable? What would it look like? What is the vision there? And the vision could be the thing that you discussed. What about if there were funding for innovations? What about if we were different structure for work or employment, as some discuss, that allowed the sector then to support itself much better, to be flexible, and then allow then for that resilience to emerge when it's needed. But if we then intervene in a way that builds much more on that strength of the sector, it will be easier to ask for resilience where it's needed.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I see here there's one question. I don't know if any of you would like to answer it or would be able to answer it. So some sectors in creative and cultural industries have typically chosen a social approach with contracts, mainly museums, libraries, while others traditionally choose liberal approaches, performing arts, for example. This is usually agreed among professionals. Is the sector perception changing on this due to the crisis? I don't know, ladies, if you know that.
I think that's quite a lot in it, which is not just about the contracts, it's about the structure of the industries as well. So obviously, and because all that discourse on sustainability really needs to connect with our knowledge of the sector. So the sector has a very different business model within it, but within those business models, there's also an element of how much is project-based, is it temporal, how much are people gonna be able to coordinate across different time frames for the project to be delivered, how much do people are engaged in the content creation versus content delivery, how these two can be split or not. So there is a lot of understanding and unpacking of those dynamics that needs to happen, rather than just simply saying some sector have got social contracts, some have not. I don't think that's a very useful split here, specifically like if you think compare a museum to a theater. Of course, a museum has got temporary exhibition, but most of his activity are quite regular and always ongoing. A theater is much more project-based. Every play needs a different cast, every activity needs a different group of people to come together. So I think there is a bit more understanding of how we link sustainability to the knowledge we already of the sector and the activity it does.
Mm-hmm. If I have time to add something just to that, I don't know how we're doing for time.
Yeah.
Well,
No.
No.
The next sector as well. Yeah, there's another question there as well. Yeah.
No, I'll leave it and we can move on to the next question. That's fine.
Yeah, so maybe the last one actually. There's Joost asking if there is any comparison of social security policies concerning culture and creative sectors in different countries. So because the percentage of independent workers seem to vary enormously between different countries.
Yeah, shall I answer that, Roberta? Just I put the link to our profiles on the website. So yes, there is, because we've also linked to another website called Compendium, which does have very detailed information about each European country's cultural policy and how it relates to the wider infrastructure of how it's managed, which governmental department it's managed, how it intersects, but it varies enormously, again, between each European national states, and so it's very hard to make a comparison at the EU level. So I hope that answered your question, but please.
Yes, and just to briefly add that the social security includes a lot, so in a sort of way includes housing policy, includes planning, includes a lot of other elements which are not strictly cultural, but if there is a good housing policy in a country, that makes a huge difference to the livelihood of artists, even if it's nothing to do with culture.
Thank you. So yeah, I think it would be interesting suggestion for the European Commission, for example, to take to produce such a mapping actually, so that everyone can access this information, because Compendium is very large. Yeah, I think it was great. Thank you very much, and I move the floor back to Tere.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Wow, this was a very, very interesting webinar. What I like it, I'm going to try to wrap up very, very briefly because it's like only 4 minutes for one. So what I really like from, I will say from this webinar, so that it's a huge effort to create a sort of, to consolidate a taxonomy of the sector. I think this is a very, very good contribution, and to create based in just 2 indicators, as inclusivity and sustainability. On the other side, I liked very much the not considering the sector as reflecting the sector as in a self-critical position. So not only what is the nature of the role of culture in more inclusive and sustainable society, but being also inclusive and sustainable ourselves. So I think we will need a further taxonomy. Well, I'm not sure taxonomy, but for sure definitions, because there's diverse concepts here. It's the idea of an indicator. It's clear that we will need new indicators. It's a proposal of cultural labor. So I think both culture and labor, they are both huge topics. And let's see how the outcome of so how the evolution of the idea of labor and work it's going to be, because this is also a huge topic to be reviewed. I think it's crucial, the idea of resilience, because it's true, it has been used by the neoliberal policies, such as giving to the workers and to the people just their own alone, letting them alone and on their own resources. Maybe it's important here, and together with resilience and with sustainability, to talk about to think about interdependence. So it is not that we are talking about one sector itself, but it's as well the relation between this sector and other sectors and other factors that construct society and constructs the way we relate to the world. And so culture is not only a sector. It develops criticism, it develops communities, it develops well-being, and this is just consider quitting culture, and then you will imagine how the effects of quitting culture will be on education. So that's true. And the last, two last things. One is the idea of the statutes of the artist. Yes, that's again something related to culture and labor. I think there's a huge work to do there. So it's true that the Commission is doing research, a huge a study on the working conditions for cultural workers. Let's see, it's going to be presented most probably at the end of second part of this year. So let's see which is the description that the final results of the study. And then a last word on innovation and experimentation, something that Elena Polizia was mentioning. Yes, we need new indicators, and this experimentation, it's not only for expressing the artists themselves, but because this experimentation helps us to provide new ways to approach the whole world. And that's back to something that it must be crucial in regarding the sustainability and inclusiveness, that should be the role of culture in the Sustainable Development Goals, should be together with the three pillars, consider the fourth pillar, together with social, economy and environment. Culture should be there from the very beginning. And thank you for the webinar. Giving back the floor to Mike.
Thank you so much, Tere, for this very important advocacy, also for the cultural and the creative sector. Thank you, everybody, for attending our webinar today. We have a next webinar coming up next week on the June 4th at 11:30 Central European Time. We are very sorry that we couldn't answer all your questions right now, and we hope to see you next week. Maybe we will have more webinars, because this discussion on sustainability, resilience is more urgent than ever. We hope you liked it, and if you wish, just hang out for a few more minutes with us just to fill in a little survey. There will be 3 very brief questions in connections to how you understand and how you define sustainable and inclusive creative economies, and what you think the priority should be post-COVID-19. We will share the data collected via the DISCE website next week. So if you want, you can subscribe also to the DISCE newsletter if you want to be informed. I wish you a very nice day and hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Voilà.